on? I'm back on. Okay. Oh, this back table is so hard. So I'm going to pull us back out of this exercise.
Yeah.
No, you're good. I'm doing pretty well for late in the day. I'm going to pull us back out of this exercise. And we want to get a little feedback from you. And then just take a couple more steps forward, and that'll wrap it up. But tell me something of what the discussion was. What outcomes did you look at? And how did they resonate with you? How did you think about them, rethink them? Yeah.
Yes, with my colleague here, she, based on our first goal, said, well,
Which is?
Basically what you're talking about is you want to test core knowledge.
Okay, and how is the goal phrased?
All right, 1 second.
Sorry.
The goal is to demonstrate substantive interdisciplinary knowledge of legal, political, economic, social, cultural, and historical factors influencing international affairs.
Okay.
And I was noting that this is something that should be kind of across all the different courses, that we have some basic knowledge about how this functions, which my colleague here said what you're asking for is some basic core knowledge. I agree. And I think we also talked about how you could test that.
Okay, and how could you?
Well, I think one way would be to have some kind of test, let's say at the beginning of their junior years, and then something in the last semester of their senior year, in order to test, how much they have absorbed in the sense of how the international system functions.
So what counts as sorry, what were you going to say? Oh, my apologies. No, go ahead.
But I hear you saying something different than core knowledge. I hear you, well, I'm thinking also the last time that I saw my dear colleague, Professor Whipple, we were at a discussion of the writing program, and I was so impressed with the writing assignments that he was giving to his students, where he was having them write white papers, and he was saying how he tells them, President Obama's getting on the plane in 15 minutes. You give him the paper, or he leaves without it.
Yeah, that's
Well, this is true.
great.
I mean,
Yeah, that's great.
And what I was trying to teach in those type of things is a president's daily brief, which is
Yeah.
1 or 2 pages
Yeah.
a piece, and that you have to write in declarative sentences. You don't give advice to the president because he doesn't need your advice. He wants your information.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, he reads this every morning, except Sundays unless he gets that probably electronically these days. So I mean, that is also, but that's a little bit different. That's more in the specific area, I think.
The thing that made me think of it is that what I hear you saying is less a test of the facts that a student has in their head, as much as their capacity to recognize dynamics and major issues around them. So, no,
I don't think that's what,
that's what I heard.
I mean, we started out with Joe saying that his students, when he says, who's the national security advisor, say, I don't know.
They're looking at it. I mean,
That's
really.
not the sentence that he read.
Yeah.
There. I heard a skills set in the sentence. That's the only thing.
Yeah, the sentences.
I heard a skill set rather than a content.
Okay, yeah, it demonstrates substantive interdisciplinary knowledge of legal, political, economic, social, cultural, and historical factors influencing international affairs.
And it's the word factors that I'm striking.
Okay.
What are the issues?
Okay.
Those little
I have-
both, it's content and which content to select, that's part of it.
I mean, I have one question. It's because I happen to have just asked Laura the same question. The word I would pause on there, and this is not to put you on the spot, it's just that you happen to direct us to this, and it's interesting because it's a really ambitious goal. So my question to you is, what counts as substantive? How do you know?
I think substantive means knowing things, understanding them.
Okay, so how do students prove that to you?
They can do it through testing, oral presentations, papers, advancing themselves in the sense of, I know I start each semester with a course of what's going on in the world. I mean, what's the president reading this morning? And it's surprising, during the course of a semester, they really start getting pretty good at it.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is something that is measurable.
Yeah, I would agree. You can actually test increased knowledge and just check in. Very interesting. So what else? What was discussion like at the back table? What were you focused on? Anyone? Sorry.
Well, the Humanities Division at CGS.
Okay.
I mentioned write and speak knowledgeably about the major periods of Western literature, visual art, and ethical philosophy from the ancient world to the present. And that's over the course of 4 semesters.
Oh, okay, so there's a long time to get that one down.
We have a 2-semester introduction to literature, film, and art.
Okay,
Then the last 2 semesters, in the sophomore year, is history methods.
okay,
So that's where we're coming from with that.
okay, very
The question
interesting.
that was raised is, how are you going to do that anyway? For God's sakes, how are you going to
Yeah,
do that?
so have you already done it? I mean, I'm curious, like, is this something you already assess?
Yeah, well, yeah.
So how do you do it?
Well, do we already assess this? This is something we're trying to assess. We've mostly been doing writing assessment
Okay,
at CGS so far. When we talked about, their knowledge of specific works of literature would be one way of testing it. The knowledge of particular authors would be one way of testing it. The knowledge about history and context, works into that. The knowledge of authors and specific works will play into that as well. And then sort of repeat that with art would be a little different. With some of the same sorts of works and authors
right.
would be relevant in terms of art. That's about as far as we got in terms of our discussion.
No, it's pretty far. I mean, you didn't have a long time to discuss, and it's a really big outcome. What else was talked about? What did you guys talk about?
Well, we actually got a little sidetracked on
No.
trying to think about efficient, because you've done
Yeah.
such a wonderful job of making this both interesting and then underscoring the importance of efficiency that we started to work on some of the all-university logistical
Oh,
problems.
cool.
So,
Okay, so what did you come up
so
with?
Mike is here from one of the professional undergraduate schools, and Anita and I have worked on general education, foundational skills and general education breadth within the arts and sciences context. And the way the task was set out originally, it seemed logical, and just correct my wording, to the professional schools to sort of count on arts and sciences
Oh,
to
that's
do
interesting.
a whole
What we include
Kind of
versus
knowledge-
what we, so there's
knowledge and
half the credits are saying
skills.
yes, is like, well, critical
And
thinking,
then
writing
we came
skills,
and-
yes also.
Exactly,
Right.
and then we
Right.
were sort of sharing that the discussion within arts and sciences has to do a lot with layering and scaffolding skills like writing and oral communication in ways that we haven't purposefully in the past, and
Right.
for fear that we will have that outcome, that writing skills have fallen off
Right.
for some cohorts in the senior year, and so we were sort of strategizing about maybe we put the AAC and U rubrics out to everyone and say, does this, everyone throughout the university, and does this line up with the kind of things? I mean, can you see
Right.
your major, your professional program in this picture, or in parts of this picture, or are there particular things in this rubric that are either highly important or missing?
Right.
And it was kind of a relief to have the rubrics, because when you look at the
Those rubrics are
outcomes for writing, for example, you realize that you can really build in
these very meaningful and, rubrics into thinking about writing, so.
Yeah, I love the ACD rubrics. I mean, a lot of people worked hard in them, and I'm really grateful.
Really good.
Yeah, well, yeah, one is
And
grateful to
they're
one's colleagues.
actually, they're wonderfully intelligible to academics and not they feel like
Yeah.
something that your colleagues wrote.
Yeah, which they did.
Yeah,
And Carol
so- no,
Carol
but
Schneider
they-
here
they
should say
both-
they
they-
did.
It's both the reality and,
Yeah.
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 And then we
use-
talked about your goal, you talked about your outcomes also.
About what?
Oh, just looking at the outcomes of the school.
Did you like them?
We've actually,
Still?
well, the 5 that we already started up with, we had another meeting last week and we reassessed them, we changed them again. And now we're looking to change, now after today's discussion, I'm looking at changing them again.
Can you tell me why? What's
Some of it
shifting in
was,
there?
was, in the 5, there were some of it was too nebulous, in terms of what is it we really wanted to get at. So again, sort of drilling down is what we wanted to learn. And some of it was this sort of overlap this. And now I'm looking at, we have some that are compound goals, and we don't know if we should break that down. It's actually very similar to your statement of, we're looking at the financial, economic, social, operational, geopolitical forces in the hospitality industry, which looks at what's going on in China, and how does that change what's going on in the rest of the world, what knowledge do we want, and how are we going to measure that, and then what's the difference between the knowledge versus the competencies to apply that knowledge.
Yeah.
Like, what do we do with it in a diverse and global workforce, which our students live in?
Yeah.
And so now it's like, okay, now what?
Yeah, but see, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm just kind of learning as I do this, and I think you've done more of this in your classes. But what I'm struck by is how ambitious the goals are and how many competencies are built in, so that if you're going to do that wonderful interdisciplinary work, you're going to demonstrate a critical capacity, a capacity to integrate across boundaries, probably a capacity to communicate pretty effectively. So when I look at that, it's like, you could probably just focus on that
Yeah,
for
so
1 year and kind of break it down
Right.
and make your life.
So our view
Easy.
was, if we put this on the website for incoming juniors
Right.
or their parents, what is it we want them to think that they're doing that we're actually teaching when they leave? So not only is it for ourselves, but it's also, you know what, we're gonna post this, we're gonna be proud of this, and what
Yeah.
is it we wanna get to? And so, well, it's not just knowing the material. So for the first one of applying the competencies and core functional areas, yeah, you have to understand an operation on the front desk, but you know what? Not only you have to know the facts, but you have to be able to apply them as well. Because that's what we're really getting at, not just you can sit there and learn stuff, but we want to be able to apply it.
Right.
And now we get to the rubrics of that, it's like, okay, so where are we coming from that? And we have tests, we have quizzes, we have case studies, we have group work. Now, so does group work count for an individual's assessment? Because it's in a group, you get a single grade. How do you measure that for individual's competency versus the team-based competency? And I didn't know how to, we didn't really have an answer. We haven't gotten to that yet. I'd love the question, I'd love.
Anyone
like
have an
your
answer
input.
to that? Yeah. Go for it.
I don't have an answer to it, but the School of Management has been working on team-based education and trying to assess individual
Mhm.
work for years now.
Right.
And they were doing it 12
It's
years
hard.
ago when I was at the School of Management
Right,
Library.
Peter Arnold was redesigning the core curriculum.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to say, if collaborative work is a goal,
Mhm.
then you don't have to break it into individuals, because it's how people function within a group.
Right,
Which
so
is
we
an
can,
important
so we can
skill
do the
set.
team-based assessment
Yeah.
for this, how well they work in a group, but if some of it is knowledge and
Mm-hmm.
understanding functional areas, so for example, they'll do a management simulation, so there's a 6-week program where they're running a restaurant, they're a general manager, and so that in that, they learn how to run a restaurant and food costs and how to serve customers and marketing and finance, and so that covers a ton of the functional areas. They get a team grade. So yes, we can measure how well they do in terms of working with each other, and they'll assess each other in terms of how well did they cooperate and communicate effectively, et cetera. But what we don't get is, well, each out of those 5 people, how much did they each independently learn in terms of that group project program? And I don't know how to unravel that.
But see, for assessment, that's not something that you need.
Yeah.
Because assessment is the effectiveness of the program, not
Not
the
the
achievement
individual
of the
person.
individual
Right.
student. So for the grade, you're done.
Is this when we do the wave?
You understood the basic distinction.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah, so if your
Okay,
program
that's
is
a great-
doing it.
Yeah, so you're done. You
yeah.
did it.
Let's go bowling.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you want to talk just sorry,
Oh.
did I cut anyone else off? Just a little bit about rubrics and
Okay,
their usefulness, because I think that's,
all right, so since we're doing,
Valid,
so,
yeah.
okay, so since we're doing, outcome goals and rubrics, and one thing that we're finding is that, you know, these goals often have like lots of moving parts, and they're really ambitious, and we want to get in like all these great things, and then the question sort of arises, like, you know, what does a good knowledge of international relations look like? You know, like, how do we know? Like, that's one thing to set the goal, is we want them to have a good knowledge of this. And so that's why, for me, I think a goal is always paired with a rubric. You know, whether, and this is where rubrics are kind of good and helpful and not reductive, or don't have to be reductive. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples of why I think that. So sort of early on in rubric thinking, you know, I think a lot of us developed rubrics, like, and I'm going to say I absolutely love this essay that Sarah Goodwin has, but I'm going to criticize the rubric a little tiny bit. So she's got her rubric in there. This is in the package with the little clippy thing on it. You know, she's got this rubric that says something like, you know, responds fully to assignment, excellent, very good, average, fair, and poor. Okay? So I think that's kind of like a really super basic rubric. And when you go to sort of meetings with colleagues in other programs who don't understand your internal language, and also when you're explaining to stakeholders, parents, prospective students, the question is going to be, responds fully to assignment. Well, what's the difference between a very good one and an excellent one? What does a very good one look like? You know, what is an average one? And so really, as we're sort of developing rubrics can serve in a supporting role to your outcomes, in the sense that they can serve to explain everything that you can't fit into the one line of your outcome. And so that's actually something that this rubric, this is another topic for her, and this is like one of the, you know, great essay, but this rubric doesn't actually do that. And this is sort of what most rubrics look like, or sort of most of what they looked like when we started out in this assessment project. And so to kind of point you to something that I think has evolved a little farther, there's this one here, and unfortunately it's the one, you'll know it because it's the one that didn't really Xerox well, because it was in color. And it's, you know, somebody in Germanic studies actually at Maryland, and they gave me permission to share this. But what they did was they actually wrote in all the box like what constitutes. So you know, I'm looking at so I'll start with the first one, the writing assessment. You know, in it's this. Yeah, you found it. It's the one with that's hard to read. Sorry about that. So appropriate linguistic register. All right, below standard, the register is barely acceptable for an academic audience, and the student demonstrates little knowledge of phrases, expressions, and vocabulary suitable for a scholarly genre. So that tells you, you know, what does a below standard one look like, instead of, you know, just good, excellent, and then all the way up to what is the above average, consistently appropriate, and then knowledge of literary concepts. So I think it kind of goes through all these different things, evidence and examples to support argument. All of the evidence and examples are specific and relevant. Explanations are given to show how each place of a piece that should be a piece of evidence supports the author's position. And then sort of on down to kind of what are the differences. So this is the place where basically I think the rubrics can have an intellectual function, in the sense that they can expand on the thing that you're saying. You know, so if you're saying like maybe this year what they really need to know about is China, you know, you can put that in your rubric. You can say, you know, what is the hospitality industry doing in China, you know, or whatever it is that for you is an expansion of this very abstract sounding goal. So if you think of the rubric and the goal as paired, as kind of each like in the rubric as an elaboration of the goal, that's where you get to think like, what would a great example of this look like? What would be like a pretty okay one look like? And that's where you get to make all these definitions really specific. And then the advantage of that is that when you're explaining to your colleagues in other disciplines who, you know, don't really know what this is supposed to look like, well, you're telling them. And then also within your programs, when you're doing the assessment, this gives you an opportunity to kind of create norms across different faculty members who are going to be doing the assessment, if you kind of tell them what, you know, what you're actually looking for.
I'm curious about this example. Is this, that you're just using?
Yeah, that you're doing study.
Is this, after one has goals and outcomes, is this an example of an assessment, or is this an example of a meta-assessment? That is, say you have a number of papers, they've been graded in particular courses, and then at another level, we're looking at those papers for whether or not they meet these criteria.
That's exactly what it is. Right, you gather the papers, you set out what you want them to look like, and then that way, like, you know, I'm a person who didn't teach that course in which the papers are written. I've got this grid of what I'm looking for. I, you know, read through the paper and I score it.
And this might be something that one would do every semester, every year?
Once a year for, I would say, you know, the minimum would be pick one outcome, assess it each year. So say this year we're assessing writing, we're doing the writing assessment. So we get, you know, 50 papers divided by 3 faculty members, sitting in a room, buy them lunch, and go. You know, go through the papers, score them on a chart, add up the information, there's your data, and that's your assessment.
It seems like if that's what one is looking for, that at some point one would integrate assessment and meta-assessment.
I agree, actually.
So what do you mean by meta-assessment? I'm not sure how you're using that.
That's assessment of a paper that's already been assessed by somebody else in a course.
Okay.
In other words, this becomes your grading rubric. Or
It could be your grading rubric, or it could be what the program decides overall. Yeah, absolutely, it could be. And so, I've seen people use the same rubric for the assessment and the grade. Okay, so the words I'm used to would be grading versus assessment. You could use this for a grade. You could use this for an assessment. Yeah, absolutely. And I think what tends to happen is once programs start doing assessment, people start taking the assessment material and saying, oh, wouldn't this be a lot easier to grade using this? And then they start.
And then the grade would indicate whether you are in fact, or whether the student is meeting the goals of the program.
Yes, and if
Well,
you,
no, because the grade, well, ideally, because the thing is that the assessment is different from the grade, because the grade on the individual assignment is going to vary by the faculty member who gives it. And the final grade for the course is going to include like lots of other extraneous elements that don't speak to learning, such as was it turned in on time, you know, which is not evidence of learning, you know, attendance, participation, things that support learning but aren't necessarily evidence of learning. So the assessment and the grade actually could be different.
The grade for the course. but
Right.
If everyone agrees that this is what we want out of the paper assignments, then theoretically, in a perfect world, the grade for the paper should be similar to
Yeah.
whether they have actually met those
Yeah.
assessment
Yeah.
goals.
I think it would be,
Yeah.
in a perfect world.
Yeah, in a perfect world, if all your
Would be.
colleagues agreed to
Yeah.
use this, and you just aggregate it up, you'd have unbelievably rich assessment data on the whole program.
And they would
Um,
be consistent with the grading. Yeah, I think that's true.
And I do wonder, sort of at the back of my mind, I always wonder, since I do think we are in a kind of paradigm shifting moment in higher ed, if at some point, 10 years from now, we're closer to that. I don't know. Just how embedded these practices get. But I find this very powerful to think of these one-line outcomes, which communicate what you want them to. You will substantially, you will know a great deal. And then have some backup so that someone who's not in your field and doesn't work with you will know what that means. And thinking about also our question at lunch, how do you account for the ineffable? There's another way, that sort of supreme artistry that is very hard to describe,
But
which exceeds all categories on the
But that's also
Is
why
beyond.
you can do it the other way, to save yourself some time. For example, you can do your assessment as something evaluated that's embedded in a course. So you can pick sort of one paper that's always graded on a particular rubric, and then you don't have to have a separate process.
Right,
Just
that's what I
report
was
out.
getting at.
Yes, you
Yes.
can do that.
Trying to.
And that's the
separate
most
process.
efficient.
So,
Yeah.
so you can do that. You
Yeah.
don't want to take the course grade, but if
No,
your
But take the papers.
papers are graded on an agreed upon rubric that everyone in the program agrees this is our goal, and they're sort of like, normed in how they score them, then you just pull those out, you plant them in the course, and then you pull them out. And that's your assessment, and you're done.
It's a great way to work. And you really can build your rubric to account for that excess beyond all expectation.
And just also to address the point you're making before that about sort of generating our own specific way of implementing the rubrics, that helped me figure out how to make this happen, at least within my own faculty. Because a couple months ago, I actually circulated to our graduate curriculum committee as an example of the kind of thing that we could do, a list of rubrics that was determined to this degree of specificity, and they instantly shut down because there was so much specificity, and they didn't like the idea of using something like this. However, if I were to just circulate the general goals and then take them through the exercise that you were talking about, so that they became ours, I think that we would probably reach a degree of specificity that is similar to this, but everybody would actually own it, as opposed to feel that it's imposed from outside.
And,
So
and
I
that,
think
and
I think
that's
really
huge,
important.
the thing about owning, because that is actually the risk of using off-the-shelf rubrics.
Yeah, that's.
Is that they're not yours,
Right.
and that what you really want to see in a good assessment practice is faculty engagement.
I would agree.
Because if there's no faculty engagement, the whole thing's just a waste of time. Because you're going to be the ones who have to go close the loop. Because if you do an assessment that you don't really believe in the results or care about it, you're not going to do anything about what you found. And so I think, I love drawing on and stealing and, taking things from places, but I also think it is equally valuable, and in many cases, a better practice that sometimes you do have to reinvent the wheel, actually, to kind of put it, that if your faculty will go through it and come out with something similar, and you know that they'll come out with something similar, but the fact that they've done it is meaningful.
I think that's what we saw happen with grantees, that people started building from the ground up, and at some point there was enough, people were persuaded enough that this was a doable task, also that it was going to take a lot of their time, and they were willing to work with materials that had already been produced. But I think always to debate them, argue them, own them, change them, make them their own. That's a lot of it. Because I think, we're out of time, and so I will just run through the last bit of this very quickly. But I think, ownership is crucial. You need to be thinking about closing the loop, which everybody talks about. That means reflecting on results, analyzing results, not necessarily deciding that you jump up and change everything. It means having a conversation and saying, so, What do we think? How do we respond to these? Are we happy with these? Does anything need adjusting? And as Laura said this morning, I mean, it's a long-term game we're playing here. It doesn't all happen in 6 months or 1 year, even 2 years. So keep that in mind. And if we had more time, I would ask you to think pretty seriously about the question of use. I mean, seriously, what do you do with these? Because if you do nothing, you are fulfilling an exercise to please the creditors, but you're really making yourself so tired for no point. And so I think there needs to be an authenticity to what you need to know in your own department, for your own students, for the health of your classes, your program, your institution. I think you really do need to think seriously about who you share with and why. And resist the impulse not to share with anyone. I can't say that enough. When the Teagle Foundation started funding collaborative research projects around assessment or collaborative assessment projects, data sharing among institutions was the biggest thing that had to be sort of worked through. People, it's just a risk. People did not want to walk into a room and say, here's how we did, how did you do? Because there was that feeling that it was a test. And I just can't say that enough, that in fact, the collaboration really facilitates institutional learning and sort of forward movement. And ultimately that will sort of work to the good of all of us. But think about that. Think about what results get posted on your college website and why.
Donna? Because I just want to jump in with something about that kind of elaborates on that point about data sharing. And because some places I've seen that people think the goal is to show that their students are learning. So then their results are like, 98% in every column. And if you're getting that from your assessment, you're not doing it right. Because really, it's like better to find out what they're not getting. Then you can, because clearly there's something that they're not getting. And so it makes it more satisfying.
Yeah, and we're just about done here. I think it's 4 o'clock and we're tired. But yeah, I guess I just want to close in a way where Laura closed, which is thinking about narratives. I mean, you'll do this work, and it's so much work. I hate to say that it's all preparation, but really it's all facilitating the overall goal of education. And just from the work I've done with Charlie Blaich, especially at Wabash, and seen done across the country, thinking about these results as a starting point for a conversation, for a starting point of what will ultimately be a narrative about your discipline, how it works, the kinds of results it produces. That's extremely powerful. And ultimately, when you're communicating to outside audiences, I mean, you can write 2 or 3 good sentences about what goes on in your program, and you'll have tons of information to back it up. And people will say, wow, that's so interesting that that's what you're doing. So, the charts and the graphs, I agree with Laura. I mean, sometimes they're helpful, but they're not the end, and they can be a distraction. The work at its best is just really powerful. So I say always stay true to yourself, hold on to the things you care about, find allies and partners where you need them, and don't make it harder than it has to be. Take small pieces, stick with the goals use the rubrics, and that's what I've learned so far in my own experience, and I've learned a lot from you today. So thank you. I think we're going to just wrap this up here. Is that?
And we'll be here if you have any.
Yeah, we're around, and we're on email. But yeah, it's time. And thank you. I think that's really it. Thank you so much for being with us. Okay.